The space around Kepler 442 looked like a light show that had been going on for 300 years. Energy beams crossed the darkness in perfect lines, while plasma torpedoes exploded in bright flashes against shield barriers. Two massive fleets faced each other across millions of miles of empty space, firing their weapons in a pattern that had become as predictable as sunrise. Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the USS Liberty, watching the distant battle through his ship's view screen. The human vessel was small compared to the giant warships fighting in the distance. Most of the alien ships were 10 times larger than his exploration vessel. Some were so big, they looked more like flying cities than spaceships. The Liberty had been mapping star systems near Earth when they picked up the energy readings from this battle. Jake's crew was supposed to be studying planets that might be good for human colonies. Instead, they had stumbled into the middle of the longest war in known galactic history. Navigator Lisa Brooks sat at her station studying the tactical displays. She was one of the best pilots Earth had ever trained, but even she looked impressed by what she was seeing. The two fleets moved like dancers, keeping perfect distance from each other while they exchanged fire. It was nothing like the chaotic space battles humans had imagined in their old movies. Chief Engineer Ryan Clark was down in the engine room, but his voice came through the communication system. He sounded excited about the energy readings his instruments were picking up. The alien weapons were more advanced than anything humans had built. Their shields could absorb incredible amounts of damage without failing. Communications officer Kate Sullivan was listening to the radio chatter from both fleets. She had learned several alien languages during her training, and she was translating what she heard. The aliens talked about their battle like it was a chess game. They discussed strategy and tactics in calm voices, as if nobody was actually dying. Jake had read about this war in Earth's databases. The crystalline Zephyrians and the insect-like Manthari Empire had been fighting over this star system for centuries. Both sides claimed it belonged to them based on ancient territorial agreements. Neither side seemed interested in actually winning the war. They just kept fighting because that was what they had always done. The battle followed rules that had been written down thousands of years ago by something called the Galactic Council. Ships had to stay a certain distance apart. Weapons could only be fired during specific time periods. Both sides were allowed to retreat and repair their ships before coming back to fight again. It was the most civilized war anyone had ever seen. Jake watched through his telescope as a Zephyrian cruiser took several direct hits from Manthari plasma cannons. The ship's shields flared bright blue, absorbing most of the damage. A few minutes later, the cruiser returned fire with its crystal beam weapons. The Manthari ship's shields turned red as they deflected the attack. Neither ship seemed to be in any real danger. Around the edges of the battle zone, Jake could see other ships watching the fight. These were neutral vessels from dozens of different alien species. Some of them were broadcasting the battle to their homeworlds like it was a sports event. Others were selling weapons and supplies to both sides during the ceasefire periods that happened every few days. Lisa turned around in her chair to look at Jake. She had been tracking the movement patterns of both fleets, and something was bothering her. The aliens were so focused on their formal battle that they were ignoring everything else happening in the system. Kate suddenly looked up from her communication station. Her face was pale, and she was listening intently to something coming. Through her headphones, she held up her hand to get everyone's attention, then switched the signal to the main speakers so everyone could hear it. The voice that came through the speakers was speaking in the Zephyrian language, but Kate translated in real time. It was a distress call from a civilian transport ship. The vessel was carrying 50,000 Zephyrian colonists to a new world, but something had gone wrong with their engines. They were drifting helplessly through space, and their course was taking them directly into the battle zone. Jake felt his stomach drop as he realized what this meant. The civilian ship was huge, but it had no weapons and no military shields. If it drifted into the middle of the battle, it would be destroyed in minutes. 50,000 innocent people would die, including thousands of children. Ryan's voice came over the intercom from the engine room. He had been monitoring the civilian ship's distress signals, and the news was bad. Their life support systems were failing. They had maybe 6 hours of air left, and their ship was already starting to break apart under the stress of its tumbling motion. Kate tried to contact both battle fleets, asking if they knew about the civilian ship. The responses she got made. Jake angry. The Zephyrian fleet commander said he was aware of the transport but could not interrupt the battle to help them. The Manthari commander was even worse. He said that civilian casualties were not his concern. Jake looked at the tactical display showing the positions of all the ships in the system. The civilian transport was drifting slowly but steadily toward the center of the battle zone. In about 4 hours, it would be right in the middle of the crossfire between the two fleets. Even if the aliens stopped shooting, the ship would probably be torn apart by the gravitational forces created by so many large vessels in one area. The neutral observer ships were also ignoring the crisis. They seemed to think that losing a civilian transport was just part of the normal cost of war. Some of them were actually taking bets on how long the ship would survive once it entered the battle zone. Lisa ran some calculations on her navigation computer. The Liberty could reach the civilian ship if they left right now and pushed their engines to maximum power. But getting there would mean flying directly through the active combat zone, dodging energy beams and plasma torpedoes from both sides. Even with their small size and advanced maneuvering systems, the chances of survival were terrible. Kate received another message from the transport ship. This time, it was from one of the civilian passengers, not the crew. It was a mother begging anyone who could hear her to save her children. Her voice was breaking with fear and desperation. Jake looked around his bridge at his crew. Lisa was running more calculations, trying to find a safe route to the transport ship. Ryan was checking their engine status to see if they could handle the stress of a high-speed rescue mission. Kate was still monitoring the distress calls, and her eyes were filling with tears as she listened to the voices of the trapped civilians outside the view screen. The ancient war continued its predictable pattern. Energy beams crossed the darkness, while a ship full of innocent people drifted toward certain death. The galaxy's most advanced civilizations watched and did nothing. Jake Morrison stared at the tactical display for a long time without saying anything. His crew waited quietly, knowing their captain was wrestling with an impossible decision. The USS Liberty was just one small ship in a system full of massive alien warships. They had no legal authority here, no political backing, and no realistic chance of success. Lisa Brooks finished her calculations and turned to face Jake. The numbers were not encouraging. Even if they pushed their experimental fusion engines beyond safe limits, they would need at least 3 hours to reach the civilian transport. That would put them in the battle zone right when the fighting was at its heaviest. The two alien fleets fired thousands of weapons every hour, creating a web of deadly energy that would be almost impossible to navigate. Kate Sullivan was still listening to the distress calls from the transport ship. More voices were coming through now as the civilian passengers realized their situation was hopeless. Parents were saying goodbye to their children. Elderly Zephyrians were recording final messages for family members on other worlds. The ship's captain had stopped trying to contact the military fleets and was just asking anyone in the system to remember that they had existed. Ryan Clark's voice came through the intercom from the engine room. He had been studying their ship's capabilities, trying to find some way to make the rescue mission work. The Liberty's engines were more advanced than most alien technology, but they were still experimental. Pushing them too hard might cause a catastrophic failure that would kill everyone on board. Jake knew what Earth's military commanders would tell him to do. The Liberty was too valuable to risk on a rescue mission with such low odds of success. Humans had only been traveling between stars for 50 years, and they only had a few dozen ships capable of deep space exploration. Losing the Liberty would set back Earth's space program by decades. He also knew what the Galactic Council would say. Humans were not members of the galactic community. They had no standing in interstellar politics and no right to interfere in ancient conflicts between established civilizations. The proper thing to do would be to file a report and let the appropriate authorities handle the situation. But Jake was not thinking about politics or military strategy. He was thinking about the voices Kate had translated for him. He was thinking about children who would never grow up and parents who would never see their families again. He was thinking about 50,000 people who were going to die because everyone else in the system had decided their lives were not worth the inconvenience of stopping a war. Lisa spoke up first. She had been Earth's top test pilot before joining the Liberty's crew. and she had never backed down from a dangerous mission. She told Jake that she could get them through the battle zone if anyone could. Her voice was steady, but her hands were shaking slightly as she gripped her control console. Ryan Quota's voice came through the speakers again. He said the engines could probably handle the stress of a high-speed rescue mission, but there were no guarantees. The fusion reactors were already running at 90% capacity just to maintain their current position in the system's gravitational field. Pushing them harder would be like playing Russian roulette with the laws of physics. Kate looked up from her communication station with tears in her eyes. She had been listening to the transport ship's internal communications, and she could hear children crying in the background. The ship's life support was failing faster than expected. They might have only 4 hours of breathable air left instead of 6. Jake tried to contact Earth's military headquarters, but they were too far away for real-time communication. Any message would take hours to reach Earth and hours more for a response to come back. By then, the civilian transport would already be destroyed. He was on his own, with only his conscience and his crew to guide him. The easy choice was obvious. Stay where they were, document what happened, and file a complete report when they returned to Earth. Nobody would blame them for refusing to attempt a suicide mission. The Liberty's crew were explorers, not soldiers. They had signed up to map star systems and study alien cultures, not to fight impossible battles against overwhelming odds. Jake thought about his hometown back on Earth. He had grown up in a small, farming community where neighbors helped each other without being asked. When someone's barn burned down, everyone pitched in to rebuild it. When a family lost their crops to bad weather, the whole community made sure they had enough food to survive the winter. It was not about politics or regulations. It was just about being human. The galactic civilization seemed to have forgotten what that meant. They had rules for everything, procedures for every situation, and committees to make every decision. They had become so civilized that they had lost track of basic decency. 50,000 people were about to die, and everyone was too busy following protocols to save them. Jake made his decision. He told Lisa to plot a course for the civilian transport at maximum speed. He ordered Ryan to push the engines beyond their normal limits and to keep them running no matter what. He instructed Kate to broadcast a message to both battle fleets, informing them that the Liberty was entering the combat zone on a humanitarian mission. His crew did not argue or complain. Lisa's fingers flew across her navigation controls, calculating the fastest route through the deadly crossfire. Ryan's voice came from the engine room, confirming that the fusion reactors were being pushed to 110% capacity. Kate composed a formal message to the alien fleets, requesting safe passage for their rescue mission. The responses from the battle fleets were predictable. The Zephyrian commander told them that civilian casualties were regrettable but acceptable, within established warfare parameters. The Manthari leader simply stated that the battle could not be postponed for inferior biological units. Both messages were delivered in the same calm, emotionless tones the aliens used to discuss tactics. Jake ignored their responses and gave the order to accelerate toward the battle zone. The Liberty's experimental engines roared to life, creating a distinctive energy signature that immediately appeared on every sensor screen in the system. The small human vessel began moving toward the massive alien fleets at a speed that made the observer ships take notice. Within minutes, emergency broadcasts were spreading across the galactic communication networks. A primitive human ship was apparently attempting to fly through the most dangerous battle zone in known space. Military analysts from dozens of species began calculating how long the Liberty would survive once the shooting started. The neutral observer ships assumed they were about to witness the destruction of Earth's first deep space exploration vessel. Some of them started recording everything, expecting to sell the footage to news networks across the galaxy. Others began placing bets on exactly how the Liberty would be destroyed. Jake did not care about any of that. He was focused on the tactical display showing the positions of the two battle fleets and the drifting civilian transport. The Liberty was now committed to a course that would take them directly through the crossfire between weapons that could vaporize their ship in seconds. As they approached the edge of the battle zone, Kate picked up more transmissions from the transport ship. Word had somehow spread among the civilian passengers that a human vessel was coming to help them. Most of them had never heard of humans before, but they were praying to their gods that these unknown aliens would succeed where their own people had failed. The Liberty crossed into the combat zone just as both fleets resumed their ritualized bombardment. Energy beams and plasma torpedoes began filling the space around them, turning the darkness into a deadly light show that could kill them at any moment. The moment the Liberty entered the battle zone, every alarm on the ship started screaming. Energy readings spiked off the charts as massive weapons fired all around them. Plasma torpedoes the size of school buses streaked past their hull, missing by distances that would have been microscopic on a galactic scale. Crystal beam weapons carved through space so close that their radiation made the ship's metal hull sing with dangerous harmonics. Lisa Brooks gripped her controls so tightly, her knuckles turned white. She had trained for dangerous flying situations, but nothing had prepared her for navigating through an active war zone. The alien weapons were designed to destroy ships much larger than the Liberty. Even a glancing hit from the smallest energy beam would tear their vessel apart like paper. The tactical display showed both battle fleets spread across millions of cubic miles of space. Zephyrian crystal ships moved in perfect geometric formations, their hulls glowing with internal energy. Manthari bioships twisted through space like living creatures, their organic weapons pulsing with deadly plasma. Between them, energy weapons created a constantly shifting maze of death. Ryan Clark's voice came from the engine room, barely audible over the sound of overstressed machinery. The fusion reactors were running at 115% capacity, well beyond their design limits. Metal components were expanding from the heat and backup systems were failing one by one, but the engines were still pushing the Liberty forward at speeds that made larger ships look like they were standing still. Kate Sullivan was monitoring communications from both battle fleets. The alien commanders were confused by the human ship's approach. Their tactical doctrines had no provisions for a vessel this small moving this fast through their combat zone. Some of the Zephyrian captains were asking their superiors for instructions on how to respond to this unprecedented situation. The Liberty's small size was both an advantage and a deadly vulnerability. They could maneuver between the massive capital ships, using them as shields against incoming fire. But they were also so tiny that the alien weapon systems had trouble tracking them. The targeting computers on both sides were designed to lock onto large enemy vessels, not small, fast-moving exploration ships. Jake Morrison stood on his bridge, watching the tactical display as his navigator found gaps in the weapons fire that computer calculations said should not exist. Lisa was flying by instinct and reflexes, making split-second decisions that kept them alive from one moment to the next. She dove the Liberty under a Manthari battleship, just as its plasma cannons fired, using the ship's own hull to block the energy beams meant to destroy them. The civilian transport was still 3 million miles away, tumbling helplessly as its structural hull began to buckle. Kate was picking up internal communications from the ship, and the situation was getting worse by the minute. Life support was failing in several sections, and some of the passengers were already unconscious from oxygen deprivation. The ship's captain estimated they had less than 2 hours before complete systems failure. Both battle fleets had noticed the Liberty now, and their reactions were typically alien. The Zephyrians transmitted formal warnings about unauthorized vessels in military zones. The Manthari sent threats about destroying inferior species who interfered with their operations. Neither side seemed to understand that the humans were trying to save civilian lives, not participate in their war. A plasma torpedo from a Manthari destroyer suddenly changed course, tracking toward the Liberty's position. Lisa saw it coming, on her sensors, and threw the ship into a spiraling dive that would have killed everyone aboard if not for their advanced inertial compensators. The torpedo missed by less than 100 meters, its plasma wake heating their hull to dangerous temperatures. The near miss got the attention of Captain Thrix, commander of the Zephyrian fleet. He sent a direct communication to the Liberty, demanding to know their intentions. When Kate translated his message, it became clear that the alien commander genuinely could not understand why humans would risk their lives for Zephyrian civilians. They had never met. Jake responded with a simple message that Kate broadcast on all frequencies. He told both fleets that the Liberty was conducting a humanitarian rescue operation and requested safe passage to the civilian transport. The response from the Manthari was immediate and hostile. Hive Commander Zack considered the human presence a violation of combat protocols and ordered his ships to treat the Liberty as a legitimate military target. Energy beams began tracking the Liberty's movement as Manthari weapons systems locked onto their ship. Lisa had to abandon her direct course toward the transport and begin evasive maneuvers that took them deeper into the battle zone. She threaded the Liberty through a debris field created by 3 centuries of warfare, using chunks of destroyed ships as cover while plasma bolts exploded all around them. Ryan reported that their shields were holding, but barely. The Liberty's defensive systems were designed to protect against cosmic radiation and micrometeorites, not military-grade weapons. Each near miss drained their energy reserves and brought them closer to catastrophic failure. The ship was shaking, so hard that Jake had to hold onto his command chair to keep from being thrown across the bridge. The Zephyrian fleet was also starting to target the Liberty, but for different reasons. Captain Thrix had decided that the human vessel was some kind of Manthari trick, a disguised attack ship pretending to conduct a rescue mission. His crystal beam weapons began firing at the Liberty's projected path, trying to force them away from Zephyrian formations. Now the Liberty was taking fire from both sides, while still trying to reach the civilian transport. Lisa's flying became increasingly desperate as she looked for any route through the crossfire that would not result in instant death. She took the ship through maneuvers that violated every safety regulation in the Earth Defense Manual, using gravitational fields from larger ships to slingshot around obstacles at impossible angles. Kate picked up a new transmission from the transport ship that made everyone's blood run cold. The civilian passengers had realized that someone was trying to reach them, and they were singing. 50,000 Zephyrian voices were joining together in what sounded like a funeral song, preparing to die with dignity while praying that their rescuers would survive, even if they could not. The sound of their singing came through the Liberty's speakers as Kate boosted the signal. Even though none of the humans understood the Zephyrian language, the melody was hauntingly beautiful and heartbreakingly sad. These people had given up hope for themselves, but they were still hoping that their children might somehow be saved. Jake felt something change inside him as he listened to their voices. This was no longer about following orders or completing a mission. This was about proving that some things in the universe were more important than politics, protocols, or even survival. These aliens were singing themselves to death while 2 of their own fleets ignored their suffering, and a small group of humans was the only thing standing between them and oblivion. He made a decision that would have shocked every military commander in Earth's Space Force. Instead of continuing their defensive approach to the transport ship, Jake ordered Lisa to go on the offensive. If the 2 battle fleets would not stop shooting long enough for a rescue, then the Liberty would make them stop. The idea was insane. 1 small exploration vessel against 2 massive battle fleets with thousands of years of military experience. But Jake had noticed something during their flight through the combat zone. The alien ships were powerful, but they were also predictable. They followed doctrine and protocol even when it worked against them. They had never faced an opponent willing to break all the rules to achieve victory. Ryan, S voice came from the engine room, reporting that he had found a way to jury-rig their mining lasers and construction tools into improvised weapons. They would not be powerful enough to destroy the alien ships, but they might be accurate enough to disable critical systems like sensors and targeting computers. Lisa plotted a new course that would take them directly toward the nearest Manthari formation. Jake gave the order to attack, and the Liberty transformed from a fleeing target into a predator hunting ship 10 times its size. The first Manthari ship that the Liberty attacked was a heavy cruiser called the Swarm Mother. It was nearly 2 miles long and carried enough weapons to level a small planet. Its bio-organic hull pulsed with living tissue, and its plasma cannons could fire projectiles the size of city blocks. Against any normal opponent it would have been invincible. But the Liberty was not normal, and neither were its tactics. Lisa Brooks brought their tiny ship in fast and low, skimming along the cruisers, hull at a distance that made their proximity alarms shriek in panic. The Manthari weapons could not track targets this close, and their shields were designed to deflect attacks from other capital ships, not precision strikes from mining equipment. Ryan Clark fired their improvised weapons with surgical accuracy. The mining lasers were designed to cut through asteroid rock, but they worked just as well on sensor arrays and communication dishes. Construction tools meant for building space stations could disrupt shield generators and targeting computers. Within seconds, the swarm mother was blind and defenseless, unable to track the small ship buzzing around its hull like an angry wasp. The psychological effect on the Manthari crew was devastating. For centuries, they had fought battles where ships maintained respectful distances and exchanged fire according to established protocols. The idea of an enemy vessel literally touching their hull while destroying their systems was so alien that many of them simply froze in shock. Hive Commander Zach watched in horror as the Liberty moved to its next target, a destroyer called the Bone Crusher. The human ship repeated its impossible attack run, disabling weapons and sensors while staying too close for return fire. The Manthari commander had never seen anything like it in 300 years of warfare. The Zephyrian fleet was equally stunned by what they were witnessing. Captain Thrix ordered his tactical officers to explain how one small vessel was neutralizing multiple Manthari ships without destroying them. The crystalline aliens prided themselves on logical thinking, but nothing about the human attack made sense according to their understanding of space combat. Jake Morrison stood on his bridge, coordinating the assault with the calm professionalism of someone who had accepted that he was probably going to die in the next few minutes. He gave orders to his crew in the same steady voice he used for routine exploration missions, as if attacking an entire battle fleet was just another day at the office. Kate Sullivan was monitoring communications from both alien fleets, and the confusion in their voices was obvious even through translation software. Manthari Hive commanders were requesting instructions for dealing with an opponent who broke every rule of civilized warfare. Zephyrian captains were recalculating their tactical models to account for combat strategies that their computers insisted were impossible. The Liberty's next target was a Zephyrian battleship called the Crystal Harmony. This vessel was even larger than the Manthari cruiser, with energy shields that could absorb direct hits from plasma torpedoes. Its crystal beam weapons could slice through the armor of any known ship design. But its defenses had the same weakness. As every other vessel in both fleets, they were designed for conventional combat between formation-flying opponents. Lisa brought the Liberty in through the battleship's shield perimeter at an angle that should have been blocked by their defensive grid. But human ships were built differently than alien vessels, with more compact designs and better maneuvering thrusters. The Liberty could twist and roll in ways that larger ships could not match, finding gaps in defenses that were supposed to be impenetrable. Ryan quote, S improvised weapons struck the Crystal Harmony's primary sensor cluster, followed by its main communications array. Within minutes, the massive battleship was as helpless as the Manthari vessels they had already disabled. Its crew could only watch through backup sensors as the tiny human ship moved on to its next victim. But the Liberty was paying a price for its aggressive tactics. The ship's hull was accumulating damage from near misses and radiation exposure. Their shields were fluctuating as power systems struggled to keep up with the demands of high-speed combat. Several crew members in the lower decks had been injured when the ship's violent maneuvers threw them against bulkheads. The situation became even more desperate when both fleets began coordinating their attacks. Manthari and Zephyrian commanders put aside their ancient rivalry long enough to focus on the common threat posed by the unpredictable human vessel. Energy beams and plasma torpedoes began converging on the Liberty's position from multiple directions. Lisa, quote, S flying, became increasingly erratic as she tried to find safe paths through the concentrated firepower of two entire battle fleets. The Liberty rolled and spun through space, using debris and disabled ships as cover while searching for its next target. Jake realized they needed to change tactics before their luck ran out completely. He spotted their opportunity when a Manthari destroyer moved to block the civilian transport's escape route. The bioship was positioning itself directly between the drifting transport and the edge of the combat zone, apparently intending to ensure that no rescue was possible. It was exactly the kind of cold calculation that made Jake's blood boil. Instead of another precision strike, Jake ordered Lisa to ram the destroyer at maximum speed. The idea was suicidal. The Liberty was less than 1/10 the size of its target, and ramming attacks violated every principle of space combat safety. But Jake was no longer thinking about safety or survival. He was thinking about 50,000 civilians whose only crime was being in the wrong place at the wrong time. The collision happened at nearly 10% of light speed. The Liberty struck the destroyer's engine section like a bullet fired from God's own rifle, punching through bioorganic armor that was supposed to be impenetrable. The impact should have vaporized the smaller ship instantly, but Ryan had reinforced their hull with emergency force fields that held just long enough to cripple the destroyer's propulsion system. Somehow, impossibly, the Liberty survived the ramming attack with most of its structure intact. The ship was badly damaged and leaking atmosphere from multiple hull breaches, but it was still flying and still fighting. The Manthari destroyer, on the other hand, was tumbling out of control with its engines destroyed and its crew unconscious. From the impact shock. The psychological effect of the ramming attack spread through both fleets like wildfire. Enemy ships began pulling back from the Liberty's position, afraid of what the insane human vessel might do next. Captains who had spent centuries perfecting the art of civilized warfare suddenly found themselves facing an opponent who was willing to die to achieve victory. Kate picked up frantic communications between the fleet commanders. They were trying to develop new tactics to deal with an enemy who ignored all established rules of engagement. Some suggested retreating until they could study human combat methods. Others wanted to focus their entire combined firepower on destroying the Liberty before it could cause more damage. But Jake was not interested in fighting both fleets to the death. His goal had always been rescuing the civilian transport, and the ramming attack had opened a corridor to the drifting ship. He ordered Lisa to make a run for the transport while the alien fleets were still reeling from shock. The Liberty limped toward its target, trailing plasma and debris from its damaged hull. Ryan reported that their engines were running on backup. Power and their life support was failing in 3 sections of the ship. They had maybe 30 minutes before catastrophic systems failure, barely enough time to attempt a rescue. The civilian transport was even worse off than they were. The massive ship was breaking apart under structural stress, and its life support had failed completely in some sections. Kate was picking up desperate transmissions from the survivors, begging anyone who could hear them to save the children first if a complete rescue was impossible. Jake looked at his battered ship and his exhausted crew, then at the dying transport, with its 50,000 passengers. They had come this far against impossible odds, fighting 2 entire battle fleets to reach people they had never met. Now they had to find a way to save those people before their own ship fell apart around them. The rescue of the civilian transport took 18 hours of continuous work that pushed both ships and crews beyond their breaking points. Ryan Clark performed miracles with the Liberty's damaged systems, jury-rigging life support equipment to keep 50,000 Zephyrian passengers alive while their own ship fell apart around them. Lisa Brooks made 17 separate docking maneuvers under combat conditions, ferrying survivors from the dying transport to temporary shelters that Kate Sullivan had improvised in their cargo bays. By the time the last passenger was safely aboard, the Liberty looked more like a floating junkyard than a starship. Hull plates were missing, entire sections were sealed off due to radiation leaks, and their main engines were held together with emergency patches and prayer. But they were alive, and so were all 50,000 civilians they had rescued from certain death. The 2 battle fleets had stopped shooting hours ago. Manthari and Zephyrian commanders found themselves in the unprecedented situation of watching their centuries-old enemy work together to evacuate wounded civilians from both sides. The Liberty's ramming attack had damaged ships from both fleets, but instead of continuing the battle, crews were helping each other with repairs and medical assistance. Captain Thrix of the Zephyrian fleet was the first to break the ancient protocols. He contacted Hive Commander Zach directly, without going through the formal diplomatic channels that had governed their conflict for 300 years. The 2 leaders spoke to each other as military professionals instead of hereditary enemies, discussing what they had witnessed and what it meant for their peoples. Jake Morrison sat in his damaged command chair, listening to Kate translate the alien communications. The exhaustion was finally catching up with him, and he could barely keep his eyes open. His ship was crippled, his crew was wounded, and they were stranded in hostile territory with no way to get home. But 50,000 people were alive who would otherwise be dead, and that made everything else worthwhile. The first indication that something fundamental had changed came when both alien fleets began withdrawing from the system, not retreating to repair their ships for the next round of combat, but actually leaving the disputed territory they had been fighting over for centuries. The Zephyrian colonists they had rescued would be allowed to settle the planets they had originally been traveling to visit, while the Manthari would establish their own colonies in a different system entirely. News of the rescue spread across the galaxy faster than anyone had expected. The neutral observer ships had recorded everything, and their broadcasts were being transmitted to every civilized world in known space. Within days, the footage of a tiny human vessel taking on two battle fleets to save civilian lives became the most watched recording in galactic history. The political implications were staggering. Earth's petition for membership in the Galactic Council, which had been ignored for decades, was suddenly fast-tracked for emergency consideration. Species that had never heard of humans before were demanding to know more about these strange aliens who valued life above politics. Military academies across the galaxy began studying the Liberty's tactics, trying to understand how conventional warfare doctrines could be so completely overturned by one small ship. Admiral Patricia Wells of Earth Defense Command arrived at Kepler Station 3 weeks later, aboard the newest ship in the human fleet. She had been sent to investigate reports that one of Earth's exploration vessels had somehow ended a 300-year war, but she found the reality even more incredible than the official dispatches had suggested. Jake met her at the docking bay, still wearing a pressure suit because half of his ship's life support systems were beyond repair. His crew was scattered across the station's medical facilities, recovering from injuries sustained during their impossible mission. The Liberty itself was in a repair dock, surrounded by alien engineers who were studying human technology with fascination and respect. The rescued Zephyrian civilians had requested permission to stay at the station until they could meet the humans who had saved their lives. Many of them had never seen members of other species before, but they waited patiently in the station's main concourse for a chance to express their gratitude. Their children drew pictures of the Liberty in crayon, showing the small human ship, as much larger than it really was, surrounded by hearts and flowers and alien words that meant thank you. Admiral Wells reviewed Jake's official report while they sat in the station's medical bay. The document was surprisingly brief for a mission that had changed galactic history. Jake had written it the same way he wrote all his reports, focusing on facts and leaving out most of the drama. He mentioned the tactical situation, described the rescue operation, and noted that the civilian casualties were 0. He did not mention that he and his crew had risked their lives to save people they had never met, because to him, that was just part of being human. The Admiral asked Jake if he understood what he had accomplished. The Zephyrian-Manthari War had been a constant factor in galactic politics for centuries. Countless diplomatic missions had failed to resolve the conflict, and military experts had assumed it would continue indefinitely. One human ship had ended it in a single day by demonstrating that there were things more important than ancient territorial disputes. Jake looked out the medical bay window at the Liberty, still surrounded by repair crews and curious alien observers. His ship looked small and battered compared to the massive vessels docked nearby, but it had proven that size and firepower were not the only factors that mattered in space combat. Sometimes courage and determination could accomplish what overwhelming force could not. Kate Sullivan had been monitoring galactic communications from her hospital bed, and she brought Jake regular updates on how different species were reacting to the news. The Ethereal Collective had declared the Liberty's crew to be heroes of universal peace. The Silicon Hegemony was studying human emotional responses to determine how they could be applied to artificial intelligence systems. Even the notoriously xenophobic Void Singers had sent congratulations through diplomatic channels. Ryan Clark was recovering from radiation exposure in the station's intensive care unit, but he was already designing improvements for the next generation of human starships. The Liberty's experimental engines had performed beyond all expectations during the mission, proving that human technology could compete with anything the galaxy had to offer. Several alien governments had quietly inquired about purchasing fusion drive systems for their own vessels. Lisa Brooks was the last crew member to be released from medical care, having suffered the most severe injuries during their combat maneuvers, but she was already planning their route home to Earth, calculating flight paths that would take them through systems where humans had never been welcome before. The galactic political situation had changed dramatically, and species that had previously ignored Earth were now eager to establish diplomatic relations. The journey home took 2 months, with stops at a dozen different worlds where local governments wanted to meet the crew of the Liberty. Jake found himself giving the same speech over and over, explaining that humans had not been trying to change galactic politics or end ancient wars. They had simply been trying to save lives, because that was what decent people did when others were in danger. When they finally reached Earth, Jake was surprised to find that news of their mission had already arrived through faster communication channels. The Liberty was met by a fleet of Earth defense vessels and escorted to the orbital station, where hundreds of reporters and government officials were waiting to interview the crew. The questions they asked were predictable but difficult to answer. How had one small ship defeated 2 entire battle fleets? What was the secret of human combat tactics? When would Earth be ready to project military power across the galaxy? Jake tried to explain that they had not been fighting a war or trying to conquer anyone. They had been conducting a rescue mission, and everything else had been secondary to that goal. The final surprise came when they docked at Earth Station 1. Representatives from 17 different alien species were waiting to meet them, along with officials from the Galactic Council, who wanted to discuss humanity's application for full membership. The small exploration mission that had started as a routine survey of nearby star systems had somehow become Earth's introduction to the wider galactic community. Jake looked back at the Liberty one last time, as they prepared to leave the docking bay. The ship would be retired from active service and displayed in the Smithsonian Museum as a symbol of humanity's first great achievement in space. But Jake knew that the real achievement was not the ship or the technology or the tactics they had used. The real achievement was proving that humans would risk everything to save innocent lives, regardless of politics, species, or the odds of success. That comma, more than anything else, was what made them human.